Hello, everyone. My name is Paul, and welcome to the Stormkeep. I'm joined today by my co-storm host.
Night podcaster JJ.
Hey, this is Morgonk.
You're not going to call yourself a night podcaster, Margonk?
Maybe some other day.
Okay, fair enough. Today we are doing a video that has been much requested by our viewers. It is about tactics and terminology. We use a lot of terms like anvil, hammer, castle that people have asked us to explain, and this is the video. We're going to talk about it all. We're also going to get into differences in how you should approach a battle, how it affects your list building, how it affects your battle tactics, and so on. So why make this video? Like I said, many of our viewers have requested that we explain these terms. Hammer, anvil, castle, bodying, DPS, all these terms that we use. We think this is going to have a lot of useful information for Stormcast as well as other factions. I think a lot of these lessons in here are universal. And we're going to look at it through a Stormcast lens, but if you play Gitz or Seraphon or another army, you'll find this information useful as well. And the video is intended for players at all skill levels. You could have heard these terms before in another tabletop game or in Age of Sigmar. Some of the concepts could be completely brand new to you. Maybe you're just starting out, or maybe you are not familiar with common warfare tactics. You could have seen these before, but maybe you didn't know what to call them. Maybe you didn't know that it was a codified thing, and you may know exactly what these are, but you've heard them used a different name. So the topics we're going to cover in this video are the hammer and anvil. We're going to talk about deployment. We're going to talk about objective control, and then we're going to go into more specific strategies like the Hallowstrike and the castle. Then we're going to talk about battle tactics, which are a new thing in 3rd edition, and how it affects your strategy and your list building. We're going to talk about translocation, some fun things you can do with it besides just getting 9-inch charges. And then we're going to finish off with some tips and tricks for using holy commands, because there's a lot of mistakes happening with them, and you want to tighten up your play. I will note that this is being recorded after the October FAQ. This is being recorded 2 days after, so if there's another update before we post it, our apologies. We haven't fully been up to date then. So first up, the hammer and anvil. It is a very common strategy in warfare. The term comes from blacksmithing, when you place heated metal on an anvil and then you beat that metal into shape with a hammer. I'm not a blacksmith, so if anybody wants to correct me, please feel free to do that in the comments, but I think I got the gist of it there. In warfare, what this typically refers to is 2 units acting together to accomplish a goal. You have an anvil unit that holds an enemy in place, and then a hammer unit comes in from a flank or from behind in order to destroy that unit. And Stormcast in particular lean towards this strategy because a lot of our units are very specialized. We have many different anvils and hammer units. Liberators are an anvil, paladins are typically hammers, and I don't think it may not be a coincidence that we use hammers and anvils in our army design, and then our units are also specialized in this way.
It certainly is a very popular. It has a very similar symbology across the entire army. The hammer and anvil.
It's ironic that the fact that the Sacrosanct are covered in anvils, but they are not anvils at all.
That is true. Almost, it's all hammers.
Yep. I guess you could argue Sequitors, but they're the least anvil of all of our Redeemer units. So
definitely.
So an anvil is a unit that holds something else in place. It's usually slow or completely disposable, but it can be fast and durable too. There's different kinds. In Age of Sigmar, this is usually a melee unit. It's really hard to hold something in place with a ranged unit. In Modern Warfare, you might see something like snipers pinning units down or forcing them to run to ground, but in Age of Sigmar, this is primarily a melee unit. I don't think there's a single example of a ranged anvil unit anywhere. At least I couldn't think of one when writing this script. So there's different types of anvil units. There's a screen. The screen is just covers a lot of space, cheap and disposable. You don't care what happens to it. If it dies, it's gone. You don't care. It's not crucial to your game plan, but it is there to get in the way and hold things in place for one turn. As opposed to a wall unit, which is more durable and meant to survive. A wall would be something like a Bastiladon, which is meant to not die. Whereas a screen could be something like a bunch of clan rats. You expect them to die, but they die and hold something in place for one turn. Then there's a tar pit, which is a little more of a nebulous term, but it's essentially just a huge unit that takes up a lot of space and forces your enemy to waste multiple turns killing it. Potentially the rest of the game. I would say examples of this would be something like Pink Hoarders are definitely a tar pit unit. Clan Rats are a tar pit unit. They just they're meant to tie something down for a long time. And then a pinner is it's usually a faster type of anvil. So, for example, a heavily armored chariot that can quickly get in on the opponent. Doesn't do a lot of damage, but it can hold them in place. Something that has a lot of speed would be called a pinner. That's not a typically used term, but that's the classification for something like that, because that is distinct from a screen, a wall, and a tar pit. And different units can be different types of anvils, right? You can have a screen pinner, a really fast disposable screen, or you can have a tar pit that is very durable, like a wall, which units like that are quite rare, but they do exist. I think Stormcast Protectors would fall into this category. If you have 15 Protectors, that is both a wall and a tar pit. Whereas,
Definitely, yeah.
Typically,
or weirdly enough, since speaking of anvils, some units, even like Annihilators, can be considered a type of pinner.
Yes, Annihilators with shields are a pinner because they use their mobility there as the deep strike charge, and they can use that to hold units in place. Yeah, they're definitely not hammers. Annihilators don't do that much damage. Now, anvils are typically more durable than hammer units, but they also tend to deal less damage in exchange. But that's not a universal thing. Some anvils can just do a lot of damage. And if you were to look at this in terms of video game terms, an anvil is like the tank. You know, depending on the game you play, some tanks do a lot of damage, but typically the goal of the tank is to hold an enemy in place so that your damage classes can do a bunch of damage. Some examples of Stormcast anvil units are Vindictors, Liberators, Protectors, Annihilators with shields, Stormstrike chariots, those are a pinner type. Stormguard drakes, despite doing a lot of damage, I would certainly classify them more as an anvil than a hammer because they're very fast and they're very durable. I would say Aetherwings are a type of anvil. They're disposable screens. Prosecutors are a pinner. The Lord Celestin on Stardrake would be an example of a wall.
Absolutely.
And this is all juxtaposed to the hammer. The hammer is meant to come in there and smash an enemy that the anvil is holding in place. They deal a lot of damage, but they really can't take damage very efficiently. Now, hammers, unlike anvils, can be ranged or melee, and typically ranged units are hammers or some kind of support piece, but you don't see ranged anvils very often. All hammer units deal really good damage. Some deal more than others. There's variation in that, and they can be fast or slow. Some hammers are quite fast, and fast and punchy is a very good combination, but that usually comes at the cost of durability. Some hammers are a lot more durable than others, and fragile hammer units are what people typically refer to as glass cannons, something that does a lot of damage but can't take any. And this kind of forms a triangle of speed, power, and durability, and units are usually good in two of these three things. If they're good in all three, then you better believe they're going to cost a lot of points. So something like a Ironjaw's Maw Crusher, those things are very fast, very durable, and have a lot of punch. So those are going to be 500 point plus models. In terms of video games, the hammer units are definitely the DPS. The tanks are holding everything in place, and the DPS or damage per second, which is you're trying to do as much damage as quickly as possible. So that's the dichotomy there. Does this sound right to you guys so far? That have you noticed this in Age of Sigmar, that units are specialized in these ways?
From my play, yes. It's actually pretty neat that I kind of already inherently knew what these things were, and now that I have an assignment to them, it's really helpful.
Yeah, it definitely makes sense to have these new classifications, especially for Stormcast Eternals. One thing I will note is when you start playing other armies, if you do play other armies that don't have as many war scrolls, some armies don't have as much of a differentiation between their hammers and their anvils. A lot of times in Age of Sigmar, particularly with armies that are lower in war scroll count, most units tend to sort of perform a dual purpose. And best examples of this could be like something like Fire Slayers, where Heartguard Berserkers are sort of your anvil and your hammer.
Yes, it's certainly possible that units play different roles depending on how the unit is used. It's not necessarily about their stats and their abilities. How you use the unit, every unit can be an anvil, right? Because if a unit dies, then it was a screen, just by definition. if you let something die on purpose, it's now a screen. But some units are better suited to it. They might be cheaper, they might have more wounds, they might take up more area. So this isn't necessarily something that they design on purpose, but it is something that just comes about because people will try to find different roles for their units, and people want to optimize how they use their units. Units can definitely pull double duty. You can use Storm Drakes as anvils or as hammers. Some examples of hammer units in the Stormcast army in particular are Vanquishers, Retributors, Grand Hammer Annihilators, Concussors, Fulminators, Evocators on Dracolines, Judicators, Vanguard Raptors, the Celestant Prime, and Karazai. So you can see pretty much every unit you would expect to be a hammer is a hammer. They do a lot of damage, and they're not as good at taking damage as the Anvils. And I'm not the tiniest bit salty that I had to put Vanquishers on this list.
I was gonna say that's I'm having a hard time believing the thing about Vanquishers, but yes, technically that is their unit classification, so it is what it is.
Just because they're bad at it doesn't mean the classification is wrong.
Exactly. Yeah, well said.
I mean, technically speaking, even pre-FAQ, we would consider Protectors a hammer unit as well, no?
Well, we'll talk about that. I would still consider them more of an anvil, but they had the capacity to be a hammer. Yeah.
No, 100%. Yeah. 100%. They are definitely meant to tie things up for a long time.
Yep, they can do both, and versatile units are very, very good. Like I really like Protectors and I really like Storm Drakes because both of those units can do a different role depending on what you need. That kind of versatility in a list is very useful because if you just have a bunch of specialized units that only do one thing and can't do anything else, if your opponent can take out those units, then they limit your ability to do those things completely. Whereas if you have units that are, let's say, 90% as good as another unit at that thing, then the game's not over if you lose your one hammer unit. So let's talk about the hammer and anvil in Stormcast armies in particular. In general, you should know that an army with too many anvils just won't deal enough damage. You have to be able to push enemies off objectives. You can't just kill one key unit and then hope the game is over. You have to also take territory as you're doing it. And your army has to pass the what's called a DPS check against certain types of lists. And in particular, those are things that have just massive amounts of wounds, high durability. So armies like certain builds of Soulblight Gravelords that just spam you with bodies, Gargants with their, effectively 50 wound dudes using the ward saves. If you're fighting against Nurgle, especially if they update the Nurgle book, you're going to see a really durable army. So you have to be able to kill these things and you have to be able to push them off objectives. If you can't wipe out units, you can't take objectives. But on the other hand, if you just bring hammers, your army will struggle to survive because you can't stop your enemy from attacking you. They will get in range, they will charge you, you can't stop that. Right? There's nothing that we have anymore. Rest in peace to Aether Wings. There's nothing we have anymore that can stop your opponent from getting to you. So you have to lose something. And when you have to lose something, it's better to lose, for example, Liberators instead of your Retributors, because then your Retributors can counterattack. Stormcast armies should generally try to have more than one hammer unit because it is certainly possible for every single opponent to neutralize one of your threats. You should assume, in fact, that your opponent can and will destroy one of your key units. So, for example, if you bring a big unit of long strikes and a big unit of protectors, you should assume that your opponent will be able to kill one of those two units. But because you have those two units, one of them can still carry you through the game. In fact, most successful lists will be some combination of 2+ hammers and 2+ anvils. That doesn't mean 2+ save, it just means you have at least 2 threats and at least 2 ways to protect those threats.
Having multiples of the same thing gives you some amount of redundancy, and so that's always a good thing to have.
Yeah, redundancy is a good thing because your opponent will be able to defeat one of them. Like if you have just one Liberator screen, your opponent will kill that screen and then push past it. They'll find a way. They will. Every army has some tricks. But if you have 3 Liberator screens, they're not getting through that in one turn. There's very few ways that anybody can punch through 3 different units of Liberators in combat in the same turn. It's very difficult to do.
About 3 units of Liberators and then 2 units of Protectors and then Gardas.
Sure, yeah. Stack it all up. And we will talk about our boy Gardas. He is excellent. Units that deal a lot of damage while also taking damage really well and also covering a lot of space are really, really useful for their strategic versatility. And I've mentioned the Storm Drake Guard already before, but this is one of the reasons Storm Drake Guard are so good is because they do everything really well. Not the best. They're not the best damage dealers. They're not the best points per wound. They're not the most durable, but they're so good at all of these things that they have a very high value from a strategic sense because they can be your anvil, they can be your hammer, and they can do both in the same game, often at the same time if you hit the right flanks and you minimize the damage you take. So typical anvils you'll see in a lot of lists are going to be Liberators in particular are very cheap. They fill a lot of battle line slots. You're going to see Vindictors because Liberators and Vindictors are pretty much the same thing, but Vindictors scale better with buffs. So you're going to see squads of 10 or 15 buffed up with Lord Castellan, Mystic Shield, things like that. You're going to see Star Drakes. They can reduce enemy hit and wound rolls. They can stack a bunch of save buffs. They have a huge base, so they make a good anvil. And you're going to see Aetherwings a lot as well because they're just very cheap and disposable. And cheap disposable bodies is something that Stormcast struggle with. Aetherwings are the perfect unit for that. In terms of hammers, the ones that we typically see these days are Fulminators. They do insane damage on the charge. Long Strikes do insane damage every turn. They're very fragile. You'll see Judicators, you'll see Grand Hammers, you'll see Evocators. Celestant Prime shows up every now and then. And then you have units that can do a little bit of both. Like you were saying, JJ, Protectors and Stormdrake Guard are these kinds of units.
So I just want to confirm one thing. Being an anvil, not necessarily just meaning taking up the enemy's time, but also taking up space on the board, right?
Yes, exactly. And that's why Gotrek, despite being incredibly durable, usually makes a pretty poor anvil because he's so slow and he takes up so little space that he struggles to keep enemies in place. So he's more of a hammer than an anvil. He's just an incredibly durable hammer.
If your opponent makes the mistake of engaging him, which ideally they shouldn't, then but otherwise, if your opponents do try and engage him on Gotrek's terms, then that's what makes him an anvil. But experienced players generally won't do that. So
yeah, he creates an exclusion zone around him, where if you enter that zone, you are throwing that unit away.
So this just goes back to your statement of games are won through movement, right?
Yes, precisely. Movement wins everything. You have to move on to objectives. You can't kill models and steal objectives. Well, there is that one battle plan that lets you do that. But in general, you have to move to win the game. And the only reason to do damage is to, stop your opponent
enemy
from
models
killing
from
you.
moving.
Stop them from moving and stop them from killing you so that you can keep moving.
Yep.
So let's look at a very specific kind of hammer and anvil tactic. It's called the riposte. It comes from fencing. It's a retaliatory thrust after parrying a lunge, usually without even changing your position or your footing. It's meant to be a quick counterattack, and in game terms, this is how it's portrayed. What you want to do typically with a hammer is keep them away from the enemy hammers, and you kind of want to engage your hammers into there so you can trade and take an advantageous position in the battle. So in that sense, you want to keep your hammer in a safe distance, but sometimes it's advantageous to counterattack right away. So let's take a look at an example of when that would occur. You can see in the photo here, there's a unit of 5 Liberators positioned in between some ruins in order to reduce the amount of total surface area that the enemy can use to get to them, and they've been charged by a Stegodon. Now, the Liberators in this situation are an anvil, and behind them, within 3 inches of the front line there, you have a unit of Protectors. These Protectors are the hammer in this case, because they're not directly taking the damage, they're not holding the unit in place, they're meant to come in and strike at the unit after it's been held. So in this particular example, you can see that the Protectors have been positioned such that any enemy entering within half an inch of the front of those Liberators will be within range for the Protectors to make a counter pile-in move. So what happens here is the Stegodon cannot reach the Protectors, and after it attacks, whether the Liberators are slain or not, the Protectors with their 3-inch reach can make a pile-in move and attack the Stegodon. This would be an example of a riposte. It is an immediate, quick counterattack, and it's based usually on your positioning.
Definitely. One thing I want to note is this is an example of a riposte over friendly units, assuming they aren't wiped out. And there's not that many units you'll be able to do this with other than Protectors. Most of the time, a riposte that you do will involve the screen in front of you dying. And going back to Paul's earlier point, this is why it helps for screening units or anvil units to sometimes be cheap. Because if you're going to lose that unit, you want to lose 115 points over, say, 125 points with a Vanquisher or 145 points with a Sequitur.
Yes, that's why Liberators are preferable to Vindictors in many circumstances because they're just cheaper. You're throwing less points away because something's got to die. Your opponent has to charge. You have to put something in their way. Something's going to die. It might as well be a 115-point unit instead of a 145-point unit.
And those points elsewhere at that point, right?
That's right. You can put them into other units in your army. You can upgrade other units. You can bring different things. Yep, it's just it's a matter of efficiency. So let's talk about controlling objectives. So it's a very wordy slide, but bear with me. There's some photos coming up after this. Standard objective control is measured by having the most models within 6 inches of the objective, and it's not wholly within 6 inches. So if you don't have to stand in the middle of an objective. One model with just the edge of its base touching that range is sufficient to control an objective. And there's a lot of benefits to that, because if you can deny your opponent the space to get within 6 inches of an objective, even if they wipe your unit out in combat, they don't control that objective because you pile in and then attack. Right? And I'll show a picture of this in a second here. Objective control is checked at the start of the game and at the end of each turn, not at the end of each round. Right? So there's no direct benefit to controlling an objective unless you're about to score them, and you generally score objectives only on your turn. So in terms of your own score, there's no reason to hold objectives defensively. You're just denying an opponent the opportunity to score. And by doing that, you're putting your units in a position that is advantageous to your opponent. So it's a trade-off of position versus short-term victory points. And Stormcast, being such an elite army, can't afford to just throw units away every single turn. So it could actually be the correct decision to just let your opponent take an objective. They've put themselves into a bad position, and then you can capitalize on it. An interesting note here, because objectives are checked at the start of the game, one of the battle tactics, Conquer, is you have to take an objective your opponent currently controls. If you don't control any objectives at the top of round 1, your opponent can't score Conquer. So just a little thing to keep in mind. There's no reason to deploy on objectives necessarily. So objectives remain under your control until the opponent gains control. So what this means effectively is you can just walk away from an objective you're holding. If you know that your opponent can't reach that objective, if they can't teleport onto it, if they can't have a fast flying unit get to it, if they don't have any units in reserve, you just walk off it. You don't have to hold it. You keep scoring points off it until your opponent takes it from you. And frankly, it might not be a bad idea to let them take objectives because it puts them in range of all of our really powerful shooting and our melee units, which have generally pretty poor mobility.
It also gives you the chance to score battle tactics that involve taking objectives.
Yes.
Sort of like a bait your opponent into giving you a battle tactic. Or it could be, they try and take it with a cheap battle line unit, and suddenly you can activate a battle tactic to kill that battle line unit.
Yep. Generally, it's more important to care about your own score than to care about your opponent's score. Now, you should try to do both, but it's better to maximize your score every turn than it is to try to stop your opponent from doing the same. Now, most battle plans do not require you to hold all the objectives. They'll say something like, score a point if you control 1 objective, score a point if you control 2 objectives, score a point if you control more than your opponent. They never, or rarely I should say, they rarely say, hold all the objectives. Right? So that's something to consider, is that you don't have to contest all 3 objectives. You can let your opponent have one, and then you can just trade back and forth over 1 objective. That's a perfect way to play Stormcast, because we want to focus all our combat in one area and let our superior stats snowball us to a victory. If we're fighting these weird skirmish battles off to the side and just throwing units away to, hold an objective slightly better than we would have, it's not worth it. Let your opponent have an objective. It's okay. You don't have to control every objective all game long. And you don't have to overcommit to objective control early in the game. If you are confident that you can table your opponent in round 3, you don't have to control objectives in round 1 or 2. Because you'll generally have enough time to score enough tactics and victory points through primary objectives on rounds 3, 4, and 5. So it's generally, I wouldn't say generally, but it can be more useful to give up that early zone control, because your opponent will spread themselves out, and then you'll have an easier time mopping them up and focusing where you want to focus your damage. All that matters at the end of the game is that you have more victory points at the end of round 5. If you have 1 more victory point, you win. So you can calculate out how much each person can score. If you max your score every turn, and if you max your opponent's score every turn, you can figure out who's going to win, right? And if you can stop your opponent from just scoring 1 point, you win.
Yeah, agreed.
Now, I find in my experience playing Stormcast armies, it is actually better to give up objective control early on, because then your opponent overextends and then you can pick the right engagements. Stormcast are not the fastest army, but we do have precision damage in the form of our shooting, and our particular melee units can do a lot of damage, but not if they don't get to melee. So you want the opponent to put themselves in bad positions and then you counterattack them. Another important thing to keep in mind is that the movement phase happens before the shooting phase. And what I mean by this is, if you bring a list that's just shooting, you're going to have a really hard time holding objectives, because your opponent can position themselves such that you are not able to move within 6 inches. All you can do is shoot them off it, and then it's an open objective. Neither player controls it. And they just walk more units onto it. So in this respect, hero phase shooting is very useful, because you can clear a unit out and then make a normal move onto its objective. So Thunderbolt Volley is very, very good. And the last thing worth mentioning here on the slide is that some battle plans have completely different rules for holding objectives, so all of this goes out the window. These are really general things. Let's take a look at some examples here. This is a photo from Martin in the Stormkeep Discord, and yes, I did pronounce your name that way on purpose. And you can see an example of how these objectives are being controlled here. On the bottom left side, you can see a unit of Liberators is just barely holding that objective. But that is, if they put the models in the middle of the objective or on the far side of it, that's the same number of models contesting that objective. The reason he's done this in particular is to increase the amount of distance that his opponent has to travel if he wants to make it to that objective. If he put his dudes in the middle, he would effectively be about 5 or 6 inches closer to his opponent, which could be the difference that he needs in order to land a charge. Now on the right side, and in the middle of the Stormcast deployment, you can see that he's put his Liberator squads up front, he's ready to riposte with his Protectors, and he has his long strikes well protected behind a unit of Liberators. Even if the units on the right get wiped out, there won't be enough distance for the units to pile in and make it to the Raptors.
The other important thing I want to note is he has made sure his Raptors are in Unleash Held range. So if anything charges the Liberator, he's ready to unleash a volley into them.
Yep, that's correct. And we'll talk more about this particular formation later in the video. This is called a castle formation, and we will talk more about it later. Here you can see an example of what I was talking about earlier. In particular, you have 5 Liberators standing just barely within range of the objective. The Stegodon has moved up, and because of the positioning of the Liberators, the Stegodon needs an 11 to finish a charge. If those Liberators were in the middle of the objective, the Stegodon would have only needed a 5, and it would have made it into melee, and it would have wiped out the Liberators and scored that point. But because the Liberators are deployed as far back as possible, the Stegodon's not able to get onto it.
Yeah, there's a lot of fast-moving units, so part of doing this strategy actually in your games will involve you asking your opponent or knowing what enemy units are capable of in terms of movement. And then you can average out an 8 or 9 inch charge and position your screens accordingly. And this effectively makes it so they last longer in the game.
Yeah, if you can put yourself 12.1 inches away from where their possible charge is, they cannot charge you. You can only declare a charge if you're within 12 inches of an enemy. So if you can map out exactly how far they can go, you can completely deny the ability for a charge. This gets a little trickier with run-in charge units, because you have to assume the D6 could be a 6, and then you have to assume their charge could be a 12. So you have to add a bit more distance there. But if you plan ahead of time, you can completely deny your opponent charging you turn 1. For the most part. There's some armies that they'll charge you. You can't stop it. But a lot of opponents, you're just giving them free distance if you put your dudes in the middle of an objective. And here's an example of the opposite of that tactic, where you're on the close side of an objective. And the reason for that is that if you'll notice, the Stegodon, when it finishes piling in combat, it cannot get within 6 inches of that objective. So even if that Stegodon swings really high and kills all of those Fulminators, its movement is done. It can't contest the objective. Now, the Seraphon player in this case has prepared a unit of Salamanders nearby to double charge, so that even if the Stegodon wipes out some models, and then the Salamanders, with their pile-in move in the next activation, can walk onto the objective and maybe finish off the unit or just have models on the objective. Now let's talk about some deployment tips and tricks. If you know you're going first, you can be aggressive. And people typically play this way, and I'm not sure it's necessarily always the correct way to play, but you can put your units right on the edge of your deployment zone in order to get the shortest possible charge. A lot of melee-focused armies will do this. You will see Slanesh players do this all the time. Ironjaw's players do it all the time. Hearthguard Berserkers and Fireslayers do it all the time. But Stormcast don't have to play this way. Because we have very, very good shooting, we can let the enemy come to us, and then we can counterattack. So you don't have to deploy on the edge. And as we were talking about on the previous slide, you can deny your opponent charges turn 1 if you deploy far back enough. That doesn't mean all the way on the edge of your board, but sometimes just a couple inches here and there, and your opponent has a 10-inch charge, or they just can't charge at all. Now, you have to know if your opponent can do a teleport or a setup, but with just one unit standing somewhere, you can deny a lot of space. And I'll show an example of this on the next slide. You can leave your own units in reserve with Scions and deploy them later directly onto enemy objectives, and this kind of creates a mind game for your opponent. If they don't have a lot of units that they can afford to hold back, you might be forcing them to keep a unit that costs 200, 300 points back on their objective if you just have a unit of Liberators in reserve. Because if they ever leave that objective, the Liberators just fall onto it and it's theirs. And one last... Go ahead.
I was actually going to say, if you can... Well, again, we'll get into castling later, but if you castle far within your territory and you force your opponent to move up, and you basically more or less tar pit most of the enemy's forces there, you could potentially just translocate your just any squad into their territory. And if you really want to be a bit of a mean guy while playing, we're playing in Ghur, right? Burn one of your objectives that you're controlling in your territory or whatever you're holding there.
Yeah, you can do that.
No, I agree. Yeah, that's actually a good example, actually.
Ghur is a lot of fun to play in terms of objectives, and I'm going to be sad to see when we finally leave the realm. So here's some things you should keep in mind when you're deploying. I made this mistake all the time, and I had to just force myself to notice this, but you have to be in range of all your abilities when you deploy. You have to plan your deployment ahead of time. So stuff that's crucial, right? Like your Lord Castellan has to be wholly within 18 inches of a unit that he wants to buff. If you have wizards and you want to unbind with them, they have to be within 30 inches of an enemy wizard. If you have a buff like Celestial Blaze that you would put on your own unit, you have to be wholly within range of that unit, usually 18 inches for a Lord character. A Lord Relictor in particular has to be wholly within 12 inches of the unit he wants to translocate. Oh, sorry, other way around. The unit has to be wholly within 12 of the Lord Relictor. Gardas wants everybody wholly within 12 for his ward. The Ordinator needs things wholly within 9. Cycle of the Storm, totally irrelevant now, but it only works on models within 18 inches. And your Adjudicators and Lockstrikes want to be able to shoot something with Thunderbolt Volley. So you want to position them so that they can shoot turn 1 without taking any return fire from the enemy. So if you know your opponent can only shoot 18 inches and they can only move 5 inches, then you know their threat range is 23 inches. So you can put your shooting just outside of that and still be able to shoot them in the hero phase on turn 1 if you position correctly. So deployment is huge for Stormcast. If you set your deployment up properly, you're gaining the extra few inches that you'll need to win the game.
Just wanted to add, don't be afraid to put your shooting units into reserve if you need to, like if you're forced into it.
Yeah, shooting units coming out of reserve is great. They don't care if they charge. The only reason you want a shooting unit on the table is if you're going to use Thunderbolt Volley with it in the first turn.
And I want to add to that. So it'll matter in matchups where your opponent has shooting capabilities or not. There's a lot of things you can avoid. For instance, you can avoid a Daughters of Cain hero phase shooting by simply putting Vanguard Raptors far back enough. But if you know for a fact that you don't have, or the opponent has lower drops than you, and they will want to wipe out your Vanguard Raptors so you can't hit them back, it would be wiser to deploy shooters in reserve accordingly.
Yes, our shooters are a precious resource, and you should treat them as very fragile. Even if it's something like 30 wounds of Judicators, you still want to treat it as something that's fragile and needs to be protected. Because the longer those Judicators live, the more likely you are to win the whole game, because you can just take your opponent's pieces off the board every turn. So let's take a look at some examples of deployments as submitted by our Stormkeep community. Here you can see, this is from Clockwork. You can see his Twitter handle there. He's done a wide deployment here with the intention of denying the opponent room to deploy any units from reserve. In this case, he was playing against a Caradron Overlords player who was going to be dropping in a bunch of dudes. And what he's done here, there's no space on the table between his units that he can fit that balloon. the only place this Karajan player can land his balloon is outside the front line there, and that'll allow him to keep a lot of his units behind the front line out of range of their guns. In particular, he's very worried about protecting his fulminators. He's okay with his liberators, his vindictors, his aether wings, and his chariot getting shot at because he wants to protect his more important units, which are the fulminators. And you'll notice he's actually down on points. I believe he has some shooting unit in reserve, most likely some long strikes. So they're not even on the table. He's not taking any risks with them. He knows he can drop them in later, and they will be as effective as they need to be. Let's talk about considerations in deployment and how it affects your list building. So there's the term one drop. What this means is you have a single deployment, usually from the battle regiment battalion. And the advantages of having a single deployment is that if you finish deploying first, you can decide who goes first in round one, or second in that case. So you can use this to take an early advantage and do crippling damage to your opponent, or you can try to go second and try to get 2 turns in a row, the bottom of one, top of 2 double turn. Very, very potent, especially with a shooting army. If you can get that, then you can deal a lot of crippling damage to your opponent. Now, some lists are only capable of functioning if they go first in round 1. They want to aggressively move up the board, contain their opponent, and stop them from doing anything. And if your opponent is allowed to leave their deployment, then these lists fall apart. They don't have the mobility or the reach to deal with a spread out opponent. Now, the downside is that a lot of people are playing one-drop lists, so you might end up just flipping a coin. And if you're relying on that first turn and you play against somebody who's also relying on the first turn, do you really want to leave everything up to just a coin flip? It seems if you're trying to go 5-0 at a GT, you probably don't want a lot of coin flips. You want more consistency than that. So what are the advantages to having more deployments? Now, you won't get to pick who goes first in round 1, but there's a lot of advantages. So first one is that you can pick other battalions and get more power to your army. So for example, you could pick the Warlord battalion to get bonus artifacts or mount traits or spells in addition to a free command point once per game. And a bigger reason I would say right now is Hunters of the Heartland can protect our hammer units from monstrous rampages. This is very important for fulminators, for storm drakes, for paladins. Any unit that wants to do a lot of damage in melee can potentially have their damage neutered if they get hit by a roar from a monster. So the Hunters of the Heartland battalion is really, really useful for that reason. In particular, it's useful for paladin units that want to use Unleash Thy Hatred or all-out attack when they get in melee.
Absolutely. And the other thing I want to quickly note is eventually we will see them tie more and more mechanics to Roar, particularly things like the Mockrish's Stomp, which on average can do 6 more wounds to your unit. So avoiding that is generally a good idea.
Yeah, in particular, stopping stomps is a good one because if they kill a unit with a stomp, then they do it again. They get to do more mechanics. So
that's really 2 Annihilators. Don't want to lose 2 Annihilators.
Yep, it's really useful in this meta to take the Hunters of the Heartland battalion. So if you're not trying to get a first turn crippling strike, consider going a few higher drops and putting some units in Hunters of the Heartland. Now, one of the subtle advantages of having more deployments than your opponent is that you get more information. As I was saying, deployment can win you the game. If you deploy correctly, you can just win the game off that deployment. And when you have more deployments than your opponent, they're putting down their whole army, and you still have a few pieces left in reserve. Why is this useful? In particular, if you have a Knight Incantor, you want to be deployed within 30 inches of a wizard that has a spell you know you really want to unbind. So for example, if you're fighting against Teclis, you know you really want to unbind his 5-up ward spell or his teleport spell. If you're playing against Nagash, you really want to make sure you unbind that spell portal. Right? There's all kinds of spells in the game that you really want to make sure you're in range, and if they deploy their wizard first, you can get the guaranteed deployment to do that. However, if you're forced to deploy your Incantor first, they can deploy out of your unbinding range, and that's a problem for you. You can deploy your shooting units out of range of their shooting units. They put down a big block of 30 sentinels, you put down your raptors 1 inch out of that potential range. And if you've also put a Knight Incantor down, you've stopped their teleport, there's no way those sentinels can reach your raptors. That's a great position to be in. You can put your anvils in line with where the enemy puts their hammers. If you see your opponent put, let's say, 6 Ghur Gruntas on one flank, okay, put an extra unit of Liberators on that side. But if the reverse situation was happening, if they were dropping afterwards, they could say, oh, you put 3 units of Liberators on this side? Okay, I'll put my Ghur Gruntas over there. And you're too slow to react to what I'm doing. And similarly, you can put your hammers in a position where they can flank or counterattack. If your opponent is pushing into your liberators, they've positioned to do that. You can put your protectors behind those liberators for a riposte, but you might not have all the information you need to do that until they've already deployed. So counter deployment is really, really important, but neither of these options is objectively correct. It depends on what your list is trying to do. With the changes to translocation, it's a lot harder to be aggressive with Stormcast. There's fewer options for it, and the options we have they're not guaranteed, let's say. They all have pretty high failure rates, about 1 in 6, 1 in 12, something like that. And for a GT, that might be an unacceptable failure rate for some people. So we're more likely to move towards a defensive style with extra battalions and extra value. So let's put all these pieces together that we've talked about here. And the first strategy we're going to look at is called the Alpha Strike. This is a term that gets thrown around a lot in the community. And what it means is an aggressive strategy that tries to take early zone control and get an early advantage. Think about a cat pouncing on its target, trying to do as much damage as possible. And there's two kinds of Alpha Strikes. There's the Blitzkrieg, which is an overwhelming amount of force on one or more fronts. It tries to do crippling damage, and it tries to snowball into a victory through very powerful and aggressive hammer units. And this is contrasted with an Alpha Tar Pit. It's less common, but what it tries to do is pin your opponent in their deployment and deny them the ability to score points by tying them down with Tar Pit units. This strategy is not that popular right now, but it is a distinct kind of Alpha Strike from the kind that just tries to kill you in the first turn. So Alpha Strikes are typically utilizing melee units in order to control the board. The reason for that is you want the space that those melee units occupy. If you have a shooting unit that's standing on an objective, that's not as threatening as having a melee unit stand on it that can hit back. Durability matters in this situation because you will be hit back. So you have to deal a lot of damage to your opponent, and if you're using primarily melee units, you're only hitting what they allow you to hit, whatever they put on their front line. So you have to be ready for the counterattack. They're going to come at you with something big. The simplest counter to an Alpha Strike is to screen and riposte, like we were showing earlier in this video. Screens can be wiped out with shooting, though, before you make a charge. So this Stormcast really excel at this because we have such good long-range shooting options that we can reliably take out screens and then get in there with our melee units into the gooey center of the enemy army, because they want to castle up, they want to be defensive, and we just shoot down their screens and then charge in anyway. Now, since Stormcast in particular, the strategy is so aggressive, you can use crossbow adjudicators. They have really, really high damage, but they only have 18-inch range. And with an Alpha Strike type of strategy, you don't really care about their 18-inch range because you want to be up in your opponent's face anyway. And some units are better suited to each type of Alpha Strike that we're talking about here. So in a Blitzkrieg, you want something like Fulminators and Grand Hammers. But in an Alpha Tar Pit, you want something like Star Drakes, Protectors, Shield Annihilators, Storm Drake Guard. And the last thing I want to say about this particular strategy is that you want to go first. If you let your opponent leave their deployment zone, then you are not pinning them in, right? So you typically want a one-drop deployment with this sort of thing, which has the downside of you can't protect your units with Hunters of the Heartland. So right now, the Alpha Strike is not the best strategy, but it can be in the right hands.
So allow me to ask you a couple of questions
Far away.
regarding to this, because in terms of Blitzkrieg and Alpha Target reminds me of second edition, where, when Soul Wars first came out, one of the biggest things going on for Stormcast at the time were blocks of sequitors, sometimes 15, sometimes 20. This was obviously before reinforcement points, and Gabriel Shoreheart to charge your opponent and try and delete something and pin them in. Now, I noticed the kinds of units you mentioned there. Is there a room in a Alpha Tar Pit to use not just sort of, because most of these units tend to be hammer units, but using Redeemers instead, like using 15 Vindictors or 15 Liberators to tie something down?
Yeah, I would classify that more as an Alpha Tar Pit. If you're trying to kill your opponent, that's more of a Blitzkrieg. These aren't terms that are widely thrown around. Everybody just calls them Alpha Strikes. I'm just trying to delineate them a little bit with some terminology here. So Alpha Tar Pit, I think the best example of that was probably right after Broken Realms came out, and Stormcast had access to a list. I remember people talking about this that was like 60 Liberators that teleport up to the enemy's front line, cover all the objectives, and say, okay, good luck killing me before the timer runs out. So that would be an Alpha Tar Pit. So the Gabriel Gavriel charging in a bunch of Sequitors, I think, would be classified as that as well, because Sequitors are not going to kill the enemy army. They're not going to do the crippling damage that you need them to do. Whereas if a lot of Ironjaw's lists these days are playing, let's say, 2 Maw Crushes and 6 Gorgruntas, and they all charge you on turn 1. That is not a tar pit. That is a blitzkrieg. They are trying to kill you, and they have the defenses necessary to stay there for 2 or 3 rounds, and they're hoping that the damage they do in the first 2 rounds leads to a victory by itself, because you just won't have the time to catch up.
Yeah, absolutely. The other thing I want to note is, yes, you're right in the sense that Hallowstrike typically involves melee units. Is there a space for a shooting Hallowstrike? And when I think of shooting Hallowstrikes, I primarily like to think of armies like Caradhran Overlords. But a particular exception to that bullet point would also be the Vanguard list from 2nd edition, where we could utilize the 1-drop. It had basically no melee hammer units. It was primarily designed to cripple your opponent's capability to play the game and occupy board space by shooting them with 3 units of Vanguard Raptors shooting twice each turn, pretty much.
Yeah, you can definitely do a ranged Alpha Strike. Lumineth in particular are very good at this. They like to get 1-drop builds. They like to have a big block of Sentinels and a bunch of Foxes dancing around. There are certain downsides with the ranged Alpha Strike, and the reason people prefer melee is because it controls space. Melee units control a certain amount of space around them.
It lets you walk onto objectives.
If you're putting your ranged units on objectives and trying to force the enemy unit in their territory, it's not going to work out very well for you, because they can hit your ranged units very easily. You're exposing yourself to do that kind of tactic. And another reason, as I mentioned before with objective control, movement happens before shooting. So if you're not on the objectives, you can't just shoot something and then walk onto them, because if you wipe the objective, there's nothing for you to take, right? So Alpha Strike shooting lists really struggle with objective control, and they have to expose themselves to the enemy. They're not typically as durable as melee units, so it seems to be that melee Alpha Strikes tend to work better, but it's not impossible to make a ranged Alpha Strike work.
And that segues into my third question. Earlier on in this video, we discussed that it's not highly, when we were discussing castle formations, it's not highly necessary to just try and take all the objectives round 1. It's a 5-round game. We can afford to give something up. And when your opponent's army spreads out, it's easier to try and focus certain areas of the map down, as opposed to try and spread out our highly elite army over multiple objectives, or just try and occupy more board space for really no great benefit. Does an Alpha Strike always have to be to try and cripple an enemy force round 1? Could it be something like you do give them the first turn, but then try and alpha them off of objectives, but because you can apply so much overwhelming force onto certain planned areas of the map instead of in their castle formation, where they are the most numerous and probably the most powerful, you would do better against screens, against whatever their counter riposte unit is?
Yeah, the idea here is you take an early advantage. It doesn't necessarily need to be the top of round 1. You could give your opponent the time to move out of their deployment. That risks them getting ahead on points, and you don't want that with an Alpha Strike typically, right? You want to reduce the capability of your opponent to score victory points. That's really what this tactic is about. If you table your opponent turn 1, like, you win because your opponent hasn't scored victory points. You don't win because you killed all their models, right? And that's why I was saying a ranged Alpha Strike can work, because it's all about just stopping your opponent from doing things. This is even though it's a very aggressive strategy, it is still, the goal is to control your opponent, right? If you give them free reign over the table round 1, they could spread out, and I wouldn't necessarily call that an Alpha Strike anymore, because if your opponent is completely spread out, you have to spread out as well, and you don't necessarily want to do that, because then you're vulnerable to getting focused down. Alpha Strikes are typically not the most durable strategy. They are focused. They focus their durability in a couple key units, like all their damage and all their defenses go into a few units, and those units try to win the game with support from other units. So let's take a look at an example. Here you can see this is a game of Stormcast versus Seraphon. The Stormcast player is doing an Alpha Strike against a castle type setup from the Seraphon player. So the Seraphon has put, you can see on one side he's got a Bastillodon, that's a tough wall unit. On the front there you've got some Saurus Knights, they're more of a screen because they're supposed to just die and then let the Stegodons and Salamanders behind them attack. And then on the other side you have some Skinks blocking deployment space. What the Stormcast player has elected to do in this situation is to get within charging range with the Fulminators, and then drop into play Celestant Prime, Tempestors, and 5 Crossbow Judicators. And the goal here is that the Crossbow Judicators with their range will be able to kill the Salamanders, because they are within 18 inches, and the Tempestors should be able to kill the Saurus Knights, and clear the way for the Fulminators to charge in and get on the Stegodon. Now, the reason you want to kill the Salamanders is because they have a very potent Unleash Hell, and you want to kill them before they have a chance to do that. The Celestant Prime is there as a secondary melee unit who can charge in with a guaranteed 12-inch charge. Now, this does risk, you'll note here, everything is more than 9 inches away from those Knights, and if those Knights are dead, the Celestant Prime may not have a unit within 12 inches. But in this particular case, it's been measured out that the Engine of the Gods is within 12 inches of the Celestant Prime, so he will have a valid charge target. So this is a very rudimentary example of an Alpha Strike. The Stormcast player is trying to engage the Seraphon player, keep them in their deployment, take out key pieces, and deal enough damage that the Seraphon player won't be able to recover in 5 rounds.
Yeah, that's it's a very good example. Yeah. Also, I should mention, a lot of times you will want to use shooting units. So don't ever build, or it's not don't ever, but it's recommended that you do not build purely melee Alpha Strikes. I think you do need shooting support, whether it's to deal with things that can unleash hell on you, or some things that can delete screens and pave way for your melee hammers to get through.
Yes, precisely. Stormcast in particular are very good at this kind of tactic because they have such good shooting options. A lot of armies that try to do Alpha Strike maneuvers, such as Ideneth Deepkin or Ironjaws, really struggle because all they can do is charge into the closest enemy unit. They don't have the space to fit their large Maw Crusher bases behind the enemy units. Oftentimes they won't have the charge distance to do that, so they just end up hitting whatever's the first thing in front of them, and that can usually just be a disposable screen, and then afterwards the opponent will counterattack and kill their key unit, trading 480 points of Maw Crusher plus artifacts for a 115-point Liberator unit.
Not a bad trade.
Pretty good. The Stormcast don't have this problem because we can shoot down the screens before we charge in. In the example you talked about earlier with Gavriel right after Soul Wars launched, a lot of those lists were using Ballista drops as well, because the Ballistas would drop into place in addition to Gavriel and a bunch of Sequitors and Evocators, and the Ballistas would try to shoot the screens out of the way so that Gavriel and his boys could do a 12-inch charge deep into the enemy lines. So let's take a look at one Stormcast list that tries to do an Alpha Strike here. This is a Tempest Lords Scions of the Storm list. It's featuring Stormdrake Guard and a Knight Dragoness to make them battle line. And you'll notice here there's a squad of 4 guard and a squad of 2 guard. The idea here is you're going to buff up the larger squad with Celestial Blades, and you're going to translocate the Judicators forward and then unleash a Thunderbolt Volley using the Draconith, because they have the Draconith keyword, they can activate the Holy Command. This is a very, very aggressive list. The only units that aren't moving forward are going to be the Lord Castellan and the Lord Relictor, just because they're very slow, they won't be able to keep up. But all the other like 1650 points in this list, almost 1700 points, is moving forward into the enemy army. The Knight Draconess and the Stormdrake Guard are very aggressive, with the Judicators shooting out screens. The Stormdrake will get a very deep charge into enemy lines, and with Tempest Lords, they have a reliably long charge as well.
Absolutely. The one thing I want to mention is in this case, we took Shock and Awe, which is pretty good for when things Scions in. And in a lot of instances, although it's not a very useful command trait, you'll find yourself using it when you're taking Annihilators and the Sword. Sometimes. Yes,
Stormcast command traits are a pile of garbage now. So Shock and Awe ended up just being the best for this particular list because it needed the Knight Draconess as its general in order to make the Stormdrake battle line. The Lord Castellan here is giving a +1 save buff to the big unit of guard, because as I mentioned, you need durability. The opponent will counterattack you, and you have to be ready for it. So if you can survive the opponent's counterattack, you're in a very good position with this list. He's also there as a force multiplier. The Arcane Tome with Celestial Blades gives the Stormdrake Guard they wound on 2s, and now they can get roared, so they might not get all-out attack, which is unfortunate, but you could potentially be on 2s and 2s when you fight with this unit. Now you'll notice the Lord Relictor, it might be odd to some people why the Lord Relictor doesn't have a mirror shield. And the reason for that is, yes, you do want to keep the Lord Relictor alive because you want your Judicators to use Thunderbolt Volley and Double Tap, but if you're going first, you don't care if your Relictor dies afterwards, right? If by the time
that is his one job, to translocate Judicators up for a Thunderbolt Volley.
Yes, that's all he's doing, and that is on a 2+. It's unfortunate that you can't take High Priest with this setup, so there is a failure point here. 1 in 6 times your Judicators will not be able to teleport up. If you feel like you can't risk it, you can drop them in play with Scions and then Thunderbolt the next turn, assuming they stay alive. But it should be noted that that is a failure point. Now this list definitely wants 1 drop, so it can't bring too many. It can't bring any other heroes, so you have to concentrate as much value as possible. And for those kind of situations, I really like the Lord Castellan with an Arcane Tome, because he can give a unit +2 to saves with Mystic Shield and his Lantern, or he can give them +1 save and Celestial Blades. I'm very fond of using this unit in these kind of strategies. You'll notice in terms of wound count, this is at a beefy 109. A lot of Stormcast lists are lucky to get to 100 wounds, and this one's sitting at 109 right now, which is very good.
Yeah.
And it's also down 20 points with nothing really that you could take. And that's fine because you can try to fish for the Triumph.
+1 to wound Triumph, yep.
Yeah.
And that saves you a Celestial Blade for the turn because you can just Mystic Shield for them that turn.
Shock and Awe is an interesting choice here because there will be times where you will want to drop your Drakes in play. With Tempest Lords rerolling 1 dice, that charge is not, I don't want to say it's easy, but it's not hard either. A 9-inch rerolling 1 dice is not that hard.
Mm-hmm.
So Shock and Awe on the turn that you get counterattacked is pretty good.
Yeah, agreed.
A second version of I wanted to make sure I included a list that didn't use Drakes. It's very hard. Drakes are very tempting right now. If you're trying to do an Alpha Strike, it's really hard to pass up on Drakes because they do a lot of damage, they're very fast, and they have a shooting attack, and they're durable, so they have a lot going for them. But I wanted to make sure I had at least one other list that didn't include them here. So you can see I have, I call this the Hammerstrike Force because it reminds me of the battalion from 1st edition Age of Sigmar, where you would drop Retributors, I think more than 3 inches away from an enemy, and then you just walk into combat pretty much. So what this is doing here, you've got 3 squads of Dracots and a big squad of Grandhammers. You've got a Toralon, in particular you've got a Ventus Fire Strike, so he has 2 spells, and you have a Battle Mage with Wild Form. Putting all the pieces together, what this list wants to do is buff the Fulminators with Celestial Blades from Aventus, and you want to buff them with Wild Form from the Battle Mage. And then you want to run your Fulminators forward at +2 using Steadfast March, the Holy Command, and then you want to give them a +2 charge, potentially with a reroll. While you're doing that, you want to drop your Annihilators into play alongside the Lord Imperator so that they can get a 7-inch rerollable charge. These 2 units pushing in together are going to be supported by Tempestors moving up and trying to shoot screens out of the way. So this doesn't have the same wound or ability to take damage as the Drakes do, but I would say this list will do a lot more damage. Those Annihilators will delete anything they hit.
Whatever they're hitting.
Yeah.
Yep, whatever they're hitting is gone.
And your opponent will be hard-pressed to say, oh, do I want to deal with those Grand Hammers or do I want to deal with those Fulminators? Because both of those units are going to kill whatever they touch. And while they're trying to figure that out, you have a Toralon and 2 units of Tempestors as well. So this is also a very aggressive list. The only unit that hangs back is the Battle Mage because he can't keep up, but everything else is just moving forward and pushing into the enemy. Do you guys have anything about Alpha Strikes that you want to mention before we move on to the castle?
The one thing I will mention is, while Alpha Strikes are great in local tournaments or in friendly games, most experienced players, it's the strategy mostly every player tries to prepare for. You will see a lot of screening and positioning, and if you sort of get over eager with your Alpha Strike and sort of don't strike them where they hurt, you will often end up wasting a lot of points attacking units that don't really matter to the opponent. So be careful. It certainly is an easy way to play, but it's one of those lists that need a higher skill level to do well with.
Yeah, if you're trying to win the game in the first 2 rounds and you're trying to just ignore, 60% of the rounds in the game and you're trying to win in the first 2, you're giving up all of your tactical flexibility in exchange for that attempt, right? So it's strange to me that alpha strikes are as common as they are in Age of Sigmar, because I don't want to say they're easily countered, but the counters for them exist across armies. It's just a matter of positioning. Some armies are better at it than others, but it's strange to me that they're as popular as they are. It seems to be most armies are trying to either slug in the middle or alpha strike. And let's look at an alternative to that, the castle. The castle is a defensive strategy that basically gives up the board early on in exchange for the perfect positioning. Think about a cat fighting on its back. It has access to all of its claws. It is technically, it's not very mobile, but it has access to everything that it needs in order to defend itself. As opposed to the alpha strike, which was a cat trying to lunge at you, this will be a cat fighting on its back. So the castle is a tight defensive formation, and it forces the opponent to fight on your terms. You dictate the combats, you dictate what the enemy is hitting. You force the enemy to come to you with your powerful long-range damage. So Adjudicators and Long Strikes in particular are very good at this, because if they don't fight you, they're just going to take losses every turn, and you can't do that for 5 rounds. If they do fight you, you completely control the terms of the engagement. You have units ready to riposte, you have all your auras and buffs in range. If they engage you early on, they're probably splitting up their army. So you're going to be fighting 2,000 points against, best case scenario, 1,500 points. Right? You can't push your entire enemy army into the enemy army.
Mm-hmm.
So,
did you see a cat fighting on its back because you have a cat?
I do have a cat. Yeah, but it is an apt analogy, I would say.
Okay. Okay.
His cat just used claws for just for reference.
So you can do the strategy entirely with just anvils and shooting units, but the best way to pull off the strategy is to also have a good melee hammer unit, because the riposte can be instantaneous, and melee units are generally better for zone control and contesting objectives, because you can kill units on the charge and take the objective at the same time, whereas if you shoot an opponent off an objective, it leaves it open for the turn and you don't control it. So you typically want more than one anvil, probably 3 or more if you want a castle, because you want to be able to cover all flanks or have multiple screens or walls in a row so your opponent has trouble getting through it. Now, the downsides of the castle are that you give up all zone control at the start of the game. Your opponent can go anywhere, they can capture any objective, they can do whatever they want. And you can risk falling too far behind on objective control and your victory points. So to compensate with this, you want to bring something that's fast, something like Aether Wings or Drakes or Chariots, or you can use your teleport abilities like Translocation, Vanguard units, or Signs of the Storm. As we were talking about earlier, you can hold a unit of Liberators in reserve if you feel like you don't need that extra wall, or sorry, that extra screen, and then just drop it in play as soon as your opponent leaves something open.
Yeah. So I want to mention a point about why a melee hammer is important. You can't just build one with lots of anvils and just shooting, but the other thing a melee hammer lets you do is, other than riposte counterattack, is it lets you be the judge of what to shoot. Ideally, you want to control what you're shooting, whether it's enemy, key support heroes in the enemy army, maybe it's a big monster, maybe it's whatever they have on objectives. And if the opponent has a lot of fast movers, like say 2 Terrageists or 2 Maw Crushers just barreling towards you, they can dictate what you're shooting. And that typically is a bad thing. You want to be dictating the terms of the engagement. And a melee hammer gives you the flexibility to shoot whatever you want, but have an answer for those units that are trying to threaten your shooting units.
It's also a matter of efficiency as well. To build on your point, if your opponent pushes a Maw Crusher in and then puts a unit of, let's say, 5 Ardboys on an objective, if you're spending your time shooting that Maw Crusher, you're not killing those Ardboys and you're not taking that objective, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
Whereas your protectors could be doing a riposte and cleaning up the Maw Crusher and then allowing your Raptors to shoot more important targets in terms of objectives. Melee units also typically tend to do a lot more damage than shooting units. The downside, of course, is that they do it in melee, which is not ideal. But shooting units...
They have to risk themselves, yep.
Not just that, but it's a matter of what's in range, right? Especially if you're using a slower counterattack unit like a Protector, it can only hit within a very small control range there. So let's take a look at some examples. I asked our community to send me photos of their castle formations, and you can see they provided. In particular, this beautiful army from John Fluflu or Jean Fluflu. He's got a beautiful blue contrast there, but let's take a look at how his units are positioned in particular. So this looks like a variation of the Hallowstrike list that we will be talking about later. It seems to have a unit of Fulminators instead of Protectors. It has some Aether Wings, and it seems like it's missing some units, right? He's got to have some stuff in reserve. So likely what's happening in this scenario is he's holding units back in order to capture objectives after his opponent has left them open. So you can see he's got a Knight Incantor, a Relictor, and a Taurolon safely behind his front wall. He's not that worried about his opponent reaching him turn 1 because he's deployed all the way at the back of the board. His long strikes provide him the reach in order to continue doing damage and force the opponent to come to them. And every turn that he's not engaged in melee, he's going to be losing something important.
Yep.
And the Fulminators are off to one side. You can see they're pushed up a little further up. I'm assuming they are going to contest objectives and charge things. Yeah, this is a typical castle setup. All the key units are in the middle, and he's waiting for his opponent to come to him. Let's take a look at another example here. This was submitted by Thundergore from the Discord. You can see he's also got a very similar unit composition. I believe he's using Retributors. Nope, I think those are Protectors with proxied Retributors as Starsoul Maces. He's got an Incantor, Relictor, 6 Long Strikes, Taurolon, and then Liberators all around. So, again, I don't want to focus on the idea that you necessarily need to use Liberators and Raptors and a Taurolon. That's not what a castle is. A castle is a formation and a playstyle. Some units fall better into it, and you might see them more often throughout these photos, but it's about the core idea here, not necessarily the units. And let's take a look at another photo from Clockwork. This type of deployment here, in particular, take a notice of the space between the Vindictors and the Fulminators. It's huge, right? It's a huge amount of space. And he's not deployed all the way. You can see the deployment line there are the blue transparent pieces. He's not deployed fully up because he wants his opponent to have a tougher charge. But he wants his opponent to charge ultimately. If he fails the charge, that's great. But what he cares more about is that when his opponent makes the charge, when he wipes out that Vindictor screen, he's not able to pile in a second unit to reach the Fulminators behind. An interesting thing about the rules that a lot of players don't know is that you can make a pile-in move even if you don't have an enemy within 3 inches, as long as you charge in that same turn. So if, for example, you charge 2 Maw Crushes, we talk about Maw Crushes a lot just because I think the Orc Battle Tome just came out. But if you charge 2 Maw Crushes, the first Maw Crusher kills the unit, the second Maw Crusher doesn't have a unit within 3 inches, it can still pile in because it made a charge move that turn. And if that unit, if that big hammer unit has a 2 or 3 inch range on its attacks, it can reach something pretty far away. But the way Clockwork has positioned his Fulminators, that's not possible. So even if those Vindictors get wiped out, even if a Maw Crusher piles in, it won't be able to reach the Fulminators. And another thing I like about this, you can see the Aether Wings are on the flanks. They will not be engaged with the primary combat. They will be used to buff the long strikes with +1 hit in the hero phase for a Thunderbolt volley, and then move off.
Or even for Unleash Hell, if he wants to do that.
Well, I don't think he's going to be.
I think he might be too far away. Yeah, he's not in range for the Vindictors, but yeah.
He could be. It certainly looks like he's in range to unleash with the Fulminators, which is an interesting little mortal wound bomb there. Probably not going to do that much damage, but it's something you can still do with it.
Yeah.
So JJ, in your limited experience, have you seen a lot of formations like this?
Not yet.
Oops, looks like we lost JJ.
What a shame. Welcome back.
Yes, sorry, my push to talk key is Alt, and I accidentally hit F4 at the same time.
I'm not editing this out.
Yeah, no, I was just saying that most of the opponents that I've played have generally been aggressive or Alpha Strike, so I can't say that I've played against more defensive castles close to what we're seeing here. I have played some castles, though, or against some castles.
Let's take a look at another example. This is again from Clockwork. A lot of the photos are from the same tournament. So you can see here he's deployed all the way on the far side of the table, trying to be within range of the objectives only with the Aether Wings. This is what's considered a deep deployment, as opposed to a wide deployment to block deep strikes. This is a deep deployment to stop enemies from charging him. In particular, what he's dealing with is a Mega Gargant that is going to be charging him 3d6 inches from 18 inches away.
Mm-hmm.
So he wanted to be as far back as possible to reduce the likelihood of that charge landing. Because if that Mega Gargant gets in turn 1, he's going to have a lot of trouble pushing it off his objectives. Whereas if he can delay it for just a turn, that might be enough time to have enough control over how the combat's going to go. He'll be able to charge his Fulminators in and double tap with his long strikes, take it out that Gargant, and take no damage in return.
Yeah, I do want to mention. I think this is tooth and nail, because he has not bothered putting anything in Scions. I think he is being forced to deploy his entire army on the board, and partly why you deploy so far back is not just to delay the charge on the Gargants, but also all 3 Gargants, I believe, come with a shooting attack, and that hitting your Raptors is just no bueno.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And this is a benefit of having more drops, right? If you can see where your opponent has put down their shooting units, you can say, oh, this is your movement, this is your shooting range, this is your threat range. I can be 0.1 inches out of that, and I'm totally safe.
Yep.
So let's take a look at a couple sample lists of how castles are built. And the first one here is the Hallowstrike list. We talked about this in episode 4, and it hasn't changed much after the FAQ. I haven't had that much time to tinker with it. So it still consists of a Relictor with High Priest and an Arcane Tome, a Lord Arcanum on Toralon, a Knight Incantor, Gardas, 6 Long Strikes, 5 Liberators, 10 Protectors, and 10 more Liberators. So those Protectors, you can swap those out for a faster unit if you want more board control, because as I mentioned, for a castle you really want durability and power, and you typically sacrifice speed in order to get those 2 things. But if you bring a unit like Concussors and Fulminators, you still have a speedy element to your list. Protectors are very durable and they're very punchy, but they're very slow. And one of the main weaknesses of castles is that you could fall behind on points and you won't have the mobility to catch up. So you need the right amount of speed in your list as well. This list in particular is also running Thunderbolt Volley and Unleash Thy Hatred. And if you swap out the Protectors, you can drop Unleash Thy Hatred and take another artifact instead. Maybe something like an Amulet of Destiny on the Lord Arcanum, so that he can leave the castle and still keep his 5-up ward from that without being near Gardas.
Mm-hmm.
Let's take a look at a different kind of castle. This one I've called the Consecralium, because that's the name of
Good word.
That's the name of the Knights Excelsior's main Stormkeep. And this list is formed around a Lord Relictor, again with Translocation and High Priest, but it uses Andrasta as a feature, and there's only elite units. There's only Liberators, Protectors, and Long Strikes. So the idea here is that you have way less wounds than a typical castle would have, but you're resurrecting models every turn. And a lot of your dudes have really good ward saves. Andrasta has a 4-up ward, the Arcanum on Toralon has a 5-up ward, the Long Strikes are doing devastating damage, the Aether Wings are disposable. So even though it's only 89 wounds, it's kind of a misnomer because you're going to be reviving stuff throughout the game. Now, the one thing I don't like about this particular version of the castle is you don't have a single good, like, big Anvil unit that can take a lot of damage. You have 2 squads of Retributors, which are going to do great, but think about what you're putting on your front line. Right? Your opponent will charge in something big and fast and punchy, and they will take out whatever you hit. So does it make sense to give up Retributors? Maybe. If you can keep the squad alive, if you give them Mystic Shield and all-out defense, then maybe they can stay alive long enough to be revived. And that's what this list is trying to do. It's trying to revive its units. Now, what's different about this castle list than a lot of others is that it's 1 drop. It's not going for Hunters of the Heartland. It's not going for extra drops to get more information. This one says, I'm deploying my whole army, and you're going first. Because I don't have the speed to fight you on your terms, on my terms. I want you to come to me. I'm going to force you into the middle of the board. I'm going to force you to fight me turn 1, and I'm going to try to get the double turn.
Yeah. Agreed.
And that's very different from how Hallowstrike plays, which is about controlled aggression and controlled engagements. This one is, this is how we're playing the game. So get on board or get out, right? Whereas with Hallowstrike, you let your opponent do what they want and you react to it accordingly. So even though you have the same kind of defensive style, even though you have the same overall strategy, very different approaches to the game.
Mm-hmm.
So let's talk about battle tactics, because we've been talking about controlling objectives and overall strategies, and let's talk about a significant source of your victory points. Battle tactics are new in Age of Sigmar 3rd edition. They're a set of secondary objectives that you do on each of your turns, and you pick them at the start of your turn. So I would take a few minutes every turn to plan out what you're going to do. Think about all the combinations, say, oh, I'm going to try to kill an enemy battle line unit, but how important is that to my overall strategy, right? If you try to do Slay the Warlord, but the Warlord has their Finest Hour and Mystic Shield and all these things, well, maybe that's not the best choice. And you got to plan out for contingencies in case you fail a charge or you fail a shooting attack or something. It is a dice game after all. I will say that battle tactics are only 2 VP per turn, so if you don't need them to win, don't feel like you have to do them, right? Like if it's more important that you wipe out an objective and take control of it, but you don't have Conquer and they're not a battle line unit, I wouldn't worry too much about it. Don't throw your whole strategy away just to score 2 victory points. It's better to try to fight your opponent, take good trades, than it is to take victory points, especially early on, because you'll always have rounds 3, 4, and 5 to score. So if you're down on rounds 1 and 2, that's okay. You can probably make up the difference if you play accordingly.
The other thing I want to say is there are about 8 or 10 battle tactics, and you can just, if you're not going to score a battle tactic that round, you can just take a throwaway battle tactic and not try and score it at all. Like you don't have to try and score your battle tactic each turn, like Paul said. The other thing is there are quite a few battle tactics that intersect with each other, and you can use them to bait things out and not try and score that particular battle tactic. So in the case of, let's say, Mega Gargants, there's two, I think, battle tactics. One is Slay the Warlord and one is Bring It Down, and those will often intersect on the same model. You can bait out their Finest Hour using one of those battle tactics, and then the next turn choose the other one to try and take that unit down.
Yep, and we will talk all about that. We're going to go through and rank each battle tactic. They're important. Battle tactics are important. I don't want to give people the impression that you can just ignore them and just try to table your opponent. Like Alpha Strike armies are going to focus less on battle tactics because they're more focused on just stopping your opponent from scoring their own victory points. So, But if you can have a small deviation in your strategy and still score a tactic, that sounds great to me, right? Like for example, if you want to do first turn, run 3 units, score 2 VP, great. Doesn't really affect you overall. It's like a free score. And it's better generally to focus on scoring your own than trying to deny your opponent. Just like with primary objectives, it's better to try to max your score because trying to deny your opponent is difficult. They're always going to have ways to do things, and it's better to make sure you have your max score each round, then try to worry about your opponent.
Yep.
Now, all that said, your overall strategy is more important than even your primary objectives and your secondary objectives. Don't throw the whole game just because you're trying to score one objective to get 1 victory point, or if you're trying to score 2 victory points off a tactic. It's a 5-round game. You don't have to win in the first 2 rounds. Think about your overall strategy. You can't fail that. Battle tactics should definitely be considered when you're building your list, right? If you build your list right, you should be able to score them every single turn without deviating too much. And we'll talk about specific tactics in a second, but some general notes are disposable units like Gryph-hounds, Aetherwings, Liberators. They're really good for a lot of tactics that just require you to do something with a unit that typically would have a very high opportunity cost for us. But if you have these units, sure, why not? Run 3 units, get 2 points.
Yeah.
Stormcast are really good at the killing tactics, like killing a battle line unit or killing the Warlord or killing a monster. We're quite good at that because we have very strong ranged units that can reach out from across the table and say, this particular thing, I will delete it. And usually the thing you want to delete, you would pick a tactic to go with it. So if there's a big unit sitting on an objective, it's probably a battle line unit. You can shoot it and score broken ranks. If it's the right time to try to kill the enemy general, or if the general is the whole list and you're trying to nuke it down, then you can do that and score Slay the Warlord. Melee hammer units, though, are much better for Conquer. Conquer is taking an opponent's objective. And doing that with a shooting unit is quite difficult, because the shooting unit won't be able to charge onto an objective if it wipes that unit out. But the melee unit will charge, kill the enemy unit, and take the objective at the same time. And the last thing I want to note for list building is you should definitely try to include at least one monster if you can. That's why Toralon features a lot in our list right now, is because there's a battle tactic called Monstrous Takeover that is almost a free score at every point of the game. So bring a Toralon, get that battle tactic scored. It's really easy. So let's go through each tactic. These are the tactics for Ghur. It is it's likely that these will change next year when they release a new battle pack for 2022, but these are the ones we're dealing with in Ghur. So first up, Conquer. You just have to take an opponent's objective away from them. And that's really easy. I would give that an A tier, because you generally want to be trading objectives anyway. You want to take an objective and not overcommit to it, because your opponent will probably be able to take it back, and you don't want to give away too much for that. So if you're just trading objectives back and forth with your opponent, and you're taking good trades and you're going to come out on top, Conquer is excellent. It probably happens any turn after round one.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I will say that Monstrous Takeover requires a unit on the battlefield, and we'll talk about Monstrous Takeover afterwards, but Conquer doesn't, right? If you don't need any particular thing on the battlefield, you can Scions into play and then steal the objective in that way. So the next three I've kind of lumped together. They're Broken Ranks, which is to kill a battle line unit, Slay the Warlord, which is to kill the enemy general, and Bring It Down, which is to slay an enemy monster. Now, all of these, you get a bonus point if you do them with a monster unit yourself. But unfortunately, Stormcast don't really have the best monster units. The list that we build, our hammer units typically aren't monsters. There are some, certainly. Drakes are good. Karazai is good. If you metamorphosis a hero, they can be decent. But in general...
Star Drakes too, yeah.
Yeah, in general, our Stormcast hero monsters aren't really good fighters, but they can finish stuff off if you shoot it first. Storm Drake Guard are really good for this. Now, the downside is if you have a lot of monsters, then your opponent can kill those monsters and get points themselves. So yeah. Now, an important thing about these ones is that tactics are chosen before heroic actions. That is not totally clear. Some people argue against that, but that's the way I've been playing it, so it's worth mentioning. You pick your tactic, and then your opponent picks a heroic action. So if you pick, for example, Slay the Warlord, and then they say, oh, okay, I'll use their Finest Hour. So you got to watch out for that. Maybe you might want to bait out their Finest Hour. You could even potentially bait out Finest Hour by saying you're going to slay the Warlord when you really have no intention on slaying the Warlord, and you've just burned one of their most valuable resources.
Mm-hmm.
The next one here, so the way I've ranked those is Broken Ranks. You're going to be killing Battle Line. The only reason it's not an S tier is because sometimes Battle Line units aren't the ones you want to be killing for strategic reasons. Like you don't want to put yourself too far overextended to kill, 20 grots that are sitting in the back for no reason. Slay the Warlord is difficult. I would say more often than not in the meta we're in, Warlords tend to be very durable monster heroes, and it can be quite hard to kill them. And they can always, like I said, they can activate their Finest Hour to make it even more difficult for you. And bring it down.
And they generally come with some sort of ward save, like a 4-up against Mortal Wounds or a 5-up Amulet of Destiny. So be careful about that one.
Yep. Now, Bring It Down, I've rated as C tier, just because some armies don't have monsters, period. You will face armies like this, even though we are in a monster meta. Bring It Down, it's pretty much Slay the Warlord in some lists, right? Like some lists only have a monster hero general, so Bring It Down in that case is the same as Slay the Warlord, but there's always an enemy general, there's not always an enemy monster.
I mean, our army's like that. There's a lot of our lists that just don't have monsters in them.
Yep, and a lot of armies have support type monsters that aren't crucial for you to kill necessarily.
Mm-hmm.
So next up is Ferocious Advance, which I talked about earlier. It's the one where you run 3 units and you get, quote, free VP. But this is actually one of the worst battle tactics for Stormcast because outside of turn 1, Stormcast really struggle to run and do things because none of our units can run and charge, none of our units can run and shoot, and you really don't want to give up charging or shooting with this army. So outside of the top of turn 1, you really want to make sure like you score this one early or you ignore it, right? It's not worth trying to get later.
Yep, it's something you do if you want to like slightly reposition your castle, like to the left or right.
Yep, that's it. That's pretty much the only time you use it. Aggressive expansion. This is the one where you have to control 2 objectives that are not wholly within your territory. And on some battle plans, this is a free score. On some battle plans, it's impossible to score because they're not impossible, but really difficult, right? Eventually, on some battle plans, it does become impossible to score because like on the Vice, for example, it goes down to 1 objective, and then you just can't score aggressive expansion. It might seem like a really good idea to try to push for this, but in my experience, I find that trying for on a lot of battle plans, pushing for this tactic will overextend you. So that's why I've rated it as B tier. It's not usually my first consideration. It's typically something I will do if it is very safe to do so because I hate overextending.
That's fair.
An important thing about this one, though, is unlike Conquer, aggressive expansion, it doesn't matter who currently controls them. So if you currently control 2 objectives that are like this, you've just scored 2 victory points at the start of your turn because there's nothing your opponent can do to stop you.
Yep.
Now, Monstrous Takeover is about as close to a free score as it can get. It requires picking a monster on the battlefield at the start of the hero phase. So what that means is you can't have any of them in reserve, and you can't use Metamorphosis to turn a hero into a monster because you have to pick it at the start of the hero phase. And it doesn't matter who currently controls it. So if you just have 1 objective in your territory, which almost every battle plan does, you put a monster on it, you've scored 2 victory points. It is so easy to score it, and it's one of the reasons you want to include a monster in every list.
Agreed.
And finally, for Ghur, Savage Spearhead. This one requires 2 units wholly within enemy territory, and it is difficult to do because we are not a fast-moving army. We want to typically fight our opponent's midfield. If you're doing an Alpha Strike, you could definitely score this one, but your opponent could also there's a lot of variation in what is defined as the enemy territory based on the battle plan. Sometimes it's half the board, sometimes it's 12 inches up or something like that. So I'm not the biggest fan of this one personally. Maybe that's because of my play styles. So I've ranked it as D tier, but I think it's probably better than, say, Ferocious Advance.
It's certainly more useful in lists that have a lot of throwaway units, or if you're fighting another highly elite army and you can sort of wear them down after the first couple of rounds and the game is in control. Sure, you could translocate like a Liberator unit up there and try to score this with something else.
Yeah, you have to have throwaway units that aren't currently doing anything. So you have to be basically in a situation where you're going to Ferocious Advance, but it's even worse because it requires specific resources, right? It requires Scions, it requires Translocation, it requires a very fast unit. And if you're using those things just to score this tactic, you're putting yourself in a bad spot. You're like throwing resources away. So either you're so far ahead and you're just trying to score tactics for spite almost, or it's just not. It's not one of those crucial ones that's going to win you the game. It could, though. It's something definitely to keep in mind. Sometimes it is the right play to think, oh, I can't kill the enemy general. It's too late for me to Ferocious Advance. I can translocate a unit and run some Aether Wings and score that one. So keep this one in mind. It's not the best, but it's also not terrible. And speaking of terrible, let's take a look at these Stormcast Eternals battle tactics. Yeah, it's a big pile of crap. First up, you've got Pioneers of the Realms, which requires contesting all objectives wholly within enemy territory with a Cities of Sigmar unit. So you don't have to control the objectives, you just have to contest them. But it requires enemy territory objectives, which, there might not be any because Ghur is hungry. It may have eaten the enemy objective. And there's only objectives on the edge of territories now. And Cities of Sigmar units really don't do very well in our army. So this is just terrible.
Yeah, they're not survivable at all. Yeah, no,
They're
it is.
not that
Until we
fast.
see Dawnbringer, until we see those Dawnbringer Crusade units, this remains an F tier.
I was going to say most of the allies that we talked about were mostly support anyway.
Yeah, we're not bringing heavy hammer units or heavy anvils from cities. I just don't see it ever happening. Really, it has to be a new book for them that changes drastically how we use those units.
Yeah, if they end up getting like this amazing hammer unit, they're like, oh my god, I need to have this in my Stormkeep's army. Then sure, but even then, it's fully within enemy territory, which means most of the time when the enemy has like a home objective, you're not trying to score that. You're just trying to score your own and then something in the middle. You don't even care about what's in their zone, really.
Yeah. The fact that you have to have all of them too, so there's too many scenarios where this is just awful, and it requires building your list around. And why would you do that? Next up is No Challenge Too Great, which requires killing an enemy hero with a Redeemer unit. So I've rated this as D tier because our Redeemers aren't doing a lot of damage. The only situation I can see this happening is because you have to plan for this, right? You can't kill it with shooting ahead of time. You can't kill it with a supporting melee unit. It has to be a Redeemer unit in melee killing this hero. And that's really hard to do. It's really hard to plan around that.
Yep.
I was going to say that, like, the only other instance I can see that happening is if you just so happen to have Vindictors around to finish a job that wasn't done, but you're not planning for that at that point.
Yeah, exactly. It's a matter of planning.
Yeah, the other thing is I can see Redeemer heavy Stormkeep lists taking this because if they get charged, and that's also like, you don't dedicate your maybe you don't dedicate a hammer unit to it, because assuming, let's say you take 10 Vindictors and Stormkeeps, they charge your Vindictor wall, the Vindictors survive, you unleash hell on them to reduce their wounds, and you're like, okay, now I have the reach to finish this off. I did the math. I can finish this off with my Vindictor unit. Okay, pick this battle tactic. Like, that's the great thing about battle tactics. You can sort of pick them situationally, but ideally, this is not something you'll go for in most Stormcast lists. Like, it's not a very common pick.
I think I realized what's wrong with these tactics versus the general ones from Ghur. These ones are super restrictive, and it's almost like they want you to build a list around getting these tactics off, whereas the Ghur ones just fit nicely into almost every list.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, these are all really specific.
There's a lot about the core enhancements and core tactics and core grand strategies that is just so widely applicable, more so than the things in our own tome. It's kind of surprising. Maybe it's like a power level check. It's better to have core things that are good rather than battle tome things that are busted. So
now I love how flavorful they are, right? From like a narrative perspective, these are awesome. But the problem is that these are matched play only, right?
Oh yeah. Wow. Yeah.
So it's not even an issue of this is a narrative element that's going to be used in match play. No. You don't use these in narrative play for the most part. These are meant for match play. So I appreciate how much effort they went into making something very flavorful, but it doesn't make a satisfying game experience, right? And I'm not making a list around No Challenge Too Great or Pioneers of the Realms. I'll score another tactic, or I'll just score nothing. I'd rather score nothing than try to score these, honestly.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, moving on. Hammerstrike Assault. Pick an enemy hero on the battlefield with 10 plus wounds and none allocated to it, and then you have to kill it. So that'll typically happen. Units don't survive more than one round, so you'll probably find some hero with that many wounds, but it might not exist, right? It could be you did some mortal wounds with Annihilators when you landed on it by accident, and a problem with this one is that this tactic is picked before Heroic Recovery. So if you are unable to pick a unit because you pick your tactics first, and then they decide to do a Heroic Recovery, and now they have fully healed, and you could have picked it, well, now it's too late. So yeah, I'd put this one in C tier. It's one of our better ones, especially because it doesn't require any list building from you. It just requires what your opponent is bringing. That's both good and bad. But I'd say it's more likely to have...
I view this as another like Bring It Down or Slay the Warlord. Like if they have like a hero monster, right, and it gives you another Bring It Down or Slay the Warlord depending on what the situation is. Because if you're trying to Alpha Strike it with Thunderbolt Volley, like it gives you another chance at it basically.
Yep.
That's a good thing. I mean, yeah, it's situational. You're not going to pick this. You're going to try and pick Slay the Warlord or bring it down. But, you declare Hammerstrike Assault, and they're like, oh, what's that?
Yep.
Can't catch them off guard.
It's not bad. The only reason, like, it's not worth being annoyed by any of these because there's no opportunity cost. You just have all of them. It's not like you're picking 5 at the start of the game or something. You just have every battle tactic. So none of them are objectively garbage. That could have. Well, that's not true. Lightning Shrouded Morale is objectively garbage. Oh my god.
Yes.
Uh,
God, what a terrible.
so
It honestly, like, it's like this whoever wrote this tactic wasn't maybe in touch with what the rest of the tone now looks like.
I don't think they're in touch with how the game works because you have to pick an enemy unit with Bravery 10, and it has to lose models to Battle Shock. Yeah. And this can be totally negated by 1 command point with Inspiring Presence. All right, let's just keep that in mind. You can counter that if you take specifically a Knight Draconis with the Thunderous Presence mount trait and you roll a 3+ after sacrificing your Monstrous Rampage. You can do that. But you still have to find a unit with Bravery 10 and then not kill the unit, right? You have to have at least 1 model survive in order to run away, and it has to fail a bravery test. And we have 0 ways to reduce bravery in the book. So
once your opponent knows you're picking this, they're like, oh, I'm saving a command point for Inspiring Presence.
This is like the Anvil's the Helden Hammer of battle tactics. It's so awful, and it's not a coincidence that both of these mechanics use bravery.
Yeah.
Just god awful. F tier. If there was a tier lower than F, I would place it there. So next up is Draconith Destruction, which requires killing an enemy unit with 10 or more models using specifically one of our dragons, either the Star Drake, the Dracoths, or a Draconith. So the downside of this is your opponent may not have a unit with 10 or more models. Or maybe you killed it already because you shot it with some long strikes for, if there's a unit with 10 plus models, it's probably battle line in this game. So you probably shot it off for broken ranks earlier. Now, you also might not have a dragon in your list. There are some lists that don't use these models. So, yeah, it's okay. If you're using those models...
It's okay, yeah. I think B is fine because we say there aren't like that, but there's quite a few lists there are. For instance, Death pretty much is running like 20 Mortec Guard, 20 Grave Guard, and for whatever reason, if you just want to kill one with if you get the opportunity to kill one with the Dracoth unit, just wipe one out, or like a Draconid Stormdrake Guard unit. Why not? I mean, it's essentially giving you 2 broken ranks.
Yep, it's something to keep in mind.
It's fine situation. So basically, it gives you another chance at the core battle tactics, but in niche scenarios. So something to keep in mind, because as the game goes on, you're gonna probably run out of battle tactics that you can reliably score. So having sort of repeat battle tactics, but for niche models and scenarios, is not the worst thing.
Yeah, it definitely also pushes us towards using dragons, which is fine because Dracoths and Stormdrakes are all really good. So it's not a bad tactic. There's no opportunity cost, so it's fine. And the last one is a Matter of Honor. You have to destroy an enemy monster with a Draconith or Stardrake. So you can't use Dracoths for this. You might not have them in your list. Your opponent might not have a monster. There's, it's just bring it down. It's a second bring it down, but you have to do it with your melee units, which might not always be possible. So it's a worse version of bring it down. But like we've been saying, no opportunity costs. You have all of these. The rankings are mostly like, which ones do I expect to typically score in a game? How easy is it to score these? How reliably can I score these?
Yep.
Now, I should mention that I had planned on doing a discussion about grand strategies, but, well, how do you guys feel about grand strategies? Let me ask you that first.
They really rarely come into play in my games. I think it came close to it in one game, but I won by 1 point.
Yeah, I don't view grand strategies as earth-shattering. I mean, they're fine, but it's very rarely you're going to end up in a tie. I think battle tactics are more important.
Yeah, I think especially right now with the battle line options we have and the ability for us to double reinforce them, more often than not, we're going to do something like hold the line.
Yeah, I'm pretty much there with you guys. I haven't had a single game where the grand strategy determined the winner yet. I think they're really cool conceptually. I don't think using them as just a tiebreaker is the way to go. I think they should be like a bonus VP that you score in an event. Like let's say you're a tournament organizer and let's say a battle, if you win, is worth, I don't know, 10 points, right? But let's say you make it worth 8 points instead, and if they got the grand strategy, it's an extra 2 points. Win or lose, if you got the grand strategy, it adds 2 points to your score. I think that's a lot more interesting than using it as a tiebreaker.
In the Age of Sigmar scoring, I'm pretty sure grand strategies give you 3 BP at the end of the battle. Because I remember seeing the Honest Wargamers score sheet, and the grand strategy, I'm pretty sure, gives you 3 BP.
Right, towards your overall score for the event, not your score for the game, right?
No, it's the game.
Oh, the game. Okay, yeah. And what I'm saying is, I prefer if it's more of a score that it goes towards your event score rather than your game score.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting use of grand strategies because it's a thing you're trying to do in addition to playing the game. Whereas most of the time you end up scoring it because you just won the game anyway.
Mm-hmm.
Like if you're losing a game, it's really hard to get a grand strategy.
Yeah.
Okay, let's talk about Translocation. Despite the changes in the errata, it is still an excellent ability with a ton of uses. Now, the simplest one, of course, is you teleport a unit forward and try to get a 9-inch charge, but we can do better than that. So let's take a look at some other things. Storm Drakes can do a move or a charge and then a charge after Translocation in the hero phase, which is a huge amount of space covered. Right? They can't move normally, but because they're able to hero phase move and then hero phase charge, they can block Unleash Hell, they can tie units down, stop them from redeploying. It's a very, very useful tactic. You can also teleport one of your Justicar units and then use Thunderbolt Volley in the same phase. I've had this problem where you teleport your unit and then you forget that you still have to be within 18 inches of a Lord or Draconith, and then you're like, oh, I guess I can't teleport there. So just keep that in mind when you do that. But that's awesome. People are hoping that their unit is out of the range of your long strikes, and then all of a sudden you just teleport them 6 inches forward, and now you're in range to shoot. It's wonderful. On the topic of holy commands, Storm Drakes do have the Draconith keyword, so they can activate this. So a fun combo is if your opponent deploys really far back and pushes up some screens, and even if you teleport, you'd be out of range of the Relictor, but you'd be out. If you teleport too far forward, you won't be in range of the enemy unit you want to shoot. Well, the Draconith can make a 12-inch normal move in the hero phase, and that might give you the range you need in order to activate the holy command from far up. You can also teleport Aether Wings forward in order to get +1 hit in the hero phase for Thunderbolt Volley. So this is the only way to get +1 hit for Thunderbolt Volley for Raptors in the hero phase, because every other effect either can't be used in the hero phase or lasts until the hero phase, like the Toralon's Comet Trail. When you land the Aether Wings, they have to be more than 9 inches from an enemy, so you are limited in what you can reach with their 12-inch ability. And the Aether Wings are almost certainly going to die after this. You've put a unit with no save on the front line of the enemy, they're dead. So if you just want a disposable +1 hit on the first turn of the game, cool. Or maybe later in the game, if you save your Thunderbolt Volley, you can hold on to it and have some suicidal birds, which will trigger Blaze of Glory when they die.
Birdemic. Shock and terror.
It's like teleporting a bunch of birds holding hand grenades. So you can use the Lord Imperatant to bring down Annihilator 7 inches from an enemy, and then translocate a second unit to charge alongside them. This strategy is a lot less useful now that you can't move after translocating, but it's better to try to get a 9-inch charge than not charge at all, right?
Yeah.
You can, if you have a very fast hero like Karazai or Krondys, you can teleport your Praetors up so that they can keep up with them. That's an interesting use of it. You can use it to leave combat. So, for example, Fulminators, your Chariots, your Annihilators, you can pull them out of combat with it and then set them up and try to charge again. You can also teleport a Wizard forward to cast a spell close to the enemy. A lot of our spells are potent but short range, like Thundershock and Starfall. They have a very strong effect on enemies within a short distance. You could also cast an endless spell like Pendulum or Geminids and hit a huge amount of the enemy army. And then for even extra cheekiness, you could use a Lord Arcanum on Gryph-Charger or a Lord Aquilar, and then you can just ride the winds back to safety.
Does Ride the Wind say instead of making a normal move? Because it says if you can't move in the phase, then I'm not sure if you can do that anymore.
Yes, that was the case in second edition. You don't have to be able to move in order to do something instead of a move.
Okay.
Yeah, so you can still do this combo. Yeah, do you guys have any other fun uses of translocation you want to mention?
I think the biggest one, not the biggest one, but a very interesting use is to protect your raptors or something from in a last minute desperation move. Like, let's say for some reason everything is going wrong, your castle's getting charged, they've torn apart your screens, and they're heading to your raptors. Translocate them out. Just send them to the other edge of the battlefield and start shooting things down.
Yeah, just an extension off that. If the opponents walked off their objectives in their territory, and you're in a losing battle on your end, you could just go to the other side of the territory and even burn the objective that you're standing on.
Yeah, salt the earth. I like it. All right, and let's talk about holy commands. So they're a new thing, and they are not like regular command abilities. They have all kinds of wonky restrictions. So let's talk about them. So for all holy commands, you have to issue the command to a unit wholly within 12 inches of a knight or wholly within 18 inches of a lord or draconeth. And Celestant Prime and Yggdrasta don't have any of these keywords, so they cannot issue holy commands. Sigmar's primary lieutenants cannot issue holy commands.
Go figure.
Bastion? Sorry?
Bastion can.
Bastion has he's Lord Commander, yes.
Okay, yeah. Sorry.
Now, Bastion in particular does have an ability that allows him to issue commands anywhere, but since the holy commands specifically mention that unit has to be within a certain range of the Lord that's issuing it, that unit does have to be wholly within 18 inches of Bastion, so the ability doesn't work on holy commands. The ability to cast it anywhere, I mean. Models cannot issue or receive more than one command per phase. This is very, very important and limits a lot of what Stormcast can do right now. And we'll talk about that with each one of these ones here. But I also want to mention, I think I have mentioned many times in this video so far, Storm Drakes can activate the holy commands. And there's a very strange interaction with this right now where the rules say that models cannot issue more than one command, but units cannot receive more than one command. So technically speaking, you can activate multiple holy commands with multiple Storm Drakes in the same unit. Because the holy commands...
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, the rules for using regular command abilities is that the unit leader can activate a command on its own unit. But it doesn't say that the other models cannot, for any reason, activate a command. Now, there are no other commands that work in this way. Typically, when you use a command with the leader, that's it. But Draconiths, the Storm Drakes, have the Draconith keyword. Each model can activate a holy command. It's a very strange rules interaction, and I don't think it's ever going to come up, but it is technically possible to use two different holy commands and then all-out defense with a unit of Storm Drakes.
Oh, goodness.
Now, you have to use those holy commands on other units because a unit can still only get one command per phase, but yeah, little wonky rules interaction there. So let's talk about Steadfast March. This ability is activated at the start of the movement phase. A lot of people think that this is used when you would run a unit, but it's actually activated at the start of the movement phase, so you have to plan your movement ahead of time. And it can't be used at the same time as, I think that should say at the double, not forward to victory, but the Run 6 command ability is what everybody calls it. So you can't do that and Steadfast March at the same time, because that would be useful, and that's not allowed. If you Steadfast March, you can't shoot, which is a big deal. A lot of the units that we want to run in charge with are Dracoths, Storm Drakes. They also want to shoot, so they lose out on a shooting attack with that. And this ability combos really well with the Battle Mage, as we discussed in our Allies video. +2 run and +2 charge, especially these days post-Translocation change. Wild form with Steadfast March is very good.
Agreed.
Thunderbolt Volley, the infamous double tap. This is activated at any time in the hero phase. Doesn't have to be at the start of the hero phase or at the end. It can be at any point, so you can buff up your dudes and then shoot.
Mm-hmm.
You can't use it if your unit is in reserve. Obviously, you're not on the table in the hero phase. If you translocate a unit forwards, make sure you're still in range to get the command. And if you have a hero out of range, you can translocate that hero in range in order to use the command. This is all stuff that happens in the hero phase. And as I mentioned in the previous one, Storm Drakes can move in the hero phase and then issue the command to a unit that you've teleported up. And then the last ones here, Unleash Thy Hatred and Final Thunderstrike, they are activated at the start of the combat phase. So this is, again, an interesting timing. This is not when you select the unit to attack, so you could potentially activate Unleash Thy Hatred, and then your opponent kills the unit that is about to get it because they're attacking first. Or let's say you activate Final Thunderstrike with a unit, and then your opponent decides to attack something else in range. It's also worth noting that units that get Unleash Thy Hatred can't receive any other commands that phase. This is in particular a problem with Paladin units that want to both get +1 hit and +1 attack. You can't do both from just command abilities. You have to get the +1 hit from another source. And all of that can just be shut down by a monster using Roar in the charge phase. So it's highly recommended that you put your melee units in a Hunters of the Heartland battalion so that doesn't happen. But Unleash Thy Hatred is nuts. It does a crazy amount of damage on every unit that uses it. Star Soul Maces going from 1 attack to 2 attacks is a huge bomb. It turns protectors from an anvil into a hammer for that one combat phase. It's pretty nuts.
Yeah, agree.
And how many times does this happen to you? You charge out of the range of activating this ability because units can't activate it on themselves, right? Like if you have Grand Hammers, they need a Lord nearby to activate this ability. They can't do it themselves. It's unfortunate, so don't make that mistake. Check your positioning before and after you finish a charge and you finish your pylons.
Definitely.
Okay, and that brings us to the end. This has been... I had a lot of fun putting this video together, personally, and hopefully it was what people were expecting. I didn't really know where to start or how to set it all up, so we'll see how people react to it. What did you guys think?
It was insightful for me, quite honestly. I was saying to Mergank, I kind of feel as though I'm a better player than I think I am, because for the first half of the video there, I understood a lot more of what we were talking about. But I still learned a ton from this and just how they interact, how the tactics interact with each other.
Yeah, I think it establishes a solid foundation that you can build upon. And obviously people will have more questions as to what to do in particular scenarios. And we can have another tactics video like this in the future. But yeah, I think knowing the basics of how to deploy is pretty important as a Stormcast player.
Yeah, this is definitely a good foundation to launch off of. If people have specific questions about where to go from there, because this is meant to be kind of an introduction, and then we can get into more specific questions. In particular, we're looking forward to doing live streams. That would be a good place for this sort of thing. We can take questions and answer them. So let's talk about our upcoming videos. Like we talked about in the previous episode, we are still planning on doing an updated tier list. We want to get that up next week. We want to do Stormcast wish listing, what we want to see. You know, maybe Celestant Prime gets +10 attacks. Maybe that's a little much. But, you know, maybe Anvil's the Heldenhammer has an ability. That would be nice, right?
Maybe Vanquishers go to 2 damage.
Maybe,
or
yeah.
at least -2 rend. -2 rend. Hey, they gave it to Ghur Grunters.
Sure, why not? So all our craziest wishes are going to come true in that episode. And that one's going to be fun to do. Because we also haven't looked at each other's wish lists. So we're kind of going to be doing it live all at once. Another thing we want to do is another list building episode, especially with the FAQ dropping and changing a whole bunch of things. We want to put forward a whole bunch of lists and talk about how we're going to be playing Stormcast moving forward. That will involve community submitted lists. So if you want to submit your list, join up in our Discord. You can find a link in the description below. And yeah,
Also, if you join the Discord, I was just going to say, if you join the Discord, there's a good chance we'll probably end up featuring your work. Case in point, we did that in this video here. Got weekly paint sessions going on. Wednesday nights for the North American crowd. And then Saturday mornings our time for the Europe crowd, which is about around noonish for you guys. And the Australian crowd, again, around noonish for you guys, but it's Saturday night our times. Just hang out, have a good time. You know, there was one time Paul and I were just watching South Park for a few hours there.
Yeah. Now that Saturday one, that's 9 p.m. our time. I think that falls into the next day in Australia. I think that's like Sunday around noon. I could be wrong. I'm not a time.
Yeah, that'll be a good point. It's 14 hours ahead, so it would be Sunday at that point for you, you folks down under there.
Cool. All right, and we are still working on battle reports. We're renovating a room. We are putting up curtains. We're going to be putting up new outlets and making a nice looking stage and producing some really good quality battle reports. So hold on to your hats because that's still coming. And to help pay for that, we have set up a Patreon account. So if you feel like you want to help support us and help us grow from a tiny little weak podcast into the next CNN that's just going to conquer every single media station in the world and just become the face of all conversation, that's our ultimate goal, world domination. If you want to help us along that, you can pitch us a few bucks and help supplement the cost of this very expensive sound equipment that we need to get. I'm not looking forward to that, but we're also looking for feedback on what you guys would want to see as patron rewards. Some stuff we have planned right now is voting on which topics come out first for videos, submitting questions for a live stream, private list workshop if you want to get ready for a tournament that's coming up. We're looking at setting up a blog talking about the tournaments that we go to, talking about our opponents and things like that. And if you're feeling very generous, you could come guest star on the podcast. We'd be happy to have people in our community. In fact, we set this up only really recently compared to when we're recording this. I'm not sure when we'll release it, but in the short time between setting it up and recording this video, we've actually gotten a few patrons already. So shout out to Champasaur, Marcus, and Dave. You guys are great. Thanks a lot for supporting us.
Absolute champs.
Love you, folks.
And here's a secret bonus slide. Okay, video's over. Bye.